Okay, let's take a moment and say that you're in a grocery store. You see a child throwing a tantrum on the ground, kicking his feet, waving his arms in the air. What's the first thing that you're going to think? And it's probably not going to be what you think it is. In each of our lives, we can reflect back and look at a time that we lost someone and we went through a process of grief. When you suffered that loss, the emotional suffering that you felt when something you love or someone you love was taken away, how did you react? Were you angry? Were you sad? Were you in denial? How did you feel? More than likely, you felt differently than the person sitting next to you. In 2004, I lost my grandmother, and I went through each of the 5 stages of grief. The emotions and feelings that come along with grief are experienced in stages and are often experienced differently among individuals. So today I'm going to talk to you about each of those 5 stages and how they can negatively impact our lives and how we're going to process them differently. Grief is the conflicting emotions that are caused by the end or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So to fully understand what grief is, we need to ask ourselves, what is grieving? Grief is our natural reaction to a loss. It's both a universal and a personal experience. Individual experiences of grief vary and are influenced by the nature of our loss. Grief is a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether the sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from the terminal diagnosis of someone they love or care about. Now that we know and understand a little bit about what grief is, we're going to talk about the 5 different stages and how they affect everyone differently. Now, when we think back to the little boy on the ground throwing his tantrum in the grocery store, most of you probably thought that he was just having a little temper tantrum. What you don't know is that little boy lost both of his parents and is now in foster care. The anger that he's representing is the projection of his grief that he's going through. So let me introduce the 5 stages of grief. The first stage of grief is denial and isolation. It's our first reaction to a problem and how we react to that. Anger is a second emotion, and it's an emotion that we tend to express most often when the harsh reality starts to set in. We project our feelings of sadness into feelings of anger and bitterness. Psychological projection is a defense mechanism people subconsciously employ in order to cope. The third stage of grief is bargaining. This one is often misused. In this stage, we typically ask ourselves, what if? What if I would have done this? Would the outcome have been different? If I would have done it differently, what would the outcome have been? And oftentimes this stage, we use it in order to regain control of the situation. The fourth stage is depression. Now, there are 2 types of depression that you can go through when grieving. The practical depression, when relating to the loss, is when we feel sadness and regret. There's also a more private depression when we prepare to accept and face the reality of the situation and the circumstances. The 5th and final stage is that of acceptance. The final stage of grief, which allows us to come to terms with the loss and allow us to find peace with the situation. Now, people who are grieving don't necessarily go through each of these 5 stages, but more than likely they're going to go through them in different orders. In our bereavement, we spend different lengths of time working through each step and through each stage with different levels of intensity. The 5 stages of loss do not necessarily occur in any specific order. Now, we've discussed the 5 stages of grief and how we experience them in various stages. Now let us talk about how grief can negatively affect us both mentally and physically. Grief is going to affect each person in this room, and it's going to be different both psychologically and physically. Our response is going to be different. Some of the psychological effects that a person can incur can include detachment, that feeling of wanting to be alone and not wanting to have anything to do with the world. The preoccupation with the loss, the going over and over and over in your mind what you could have done differently. The inability to show or experience joy is the process that you're unable to process your emotions properly. Confusion and memory problems. Each of these are related to the psychological effects that can negatively impact you with grief. Some of the physical effects that can include are exhaustion, the physically being tired and not being able to get on with your normal life. This can stem from grieving. Chest pain, digestive problems, and insomnia are all related to stress that can be caused by grief in our lives. Now, I've given you the information on what grief is and the various stages of grief in our life, and the negative effects that it can have on each of us individually. Through this knowledge, I hope that we're able to see that every person is going to process grief and grieve differently, and that we must realize that there is no universal sign for grieving or a set amount of time in which we're able to mourn those we have lost. Through this information, I hope that you're able to be mindful of those around you and be more aware of the situations that may be at hand.